SEP FanFic Readings presents The Watergaw by smokybaltic and ectoheart. Chapter 2. It was easy enough for them to agree to take the day to recover and strategize. Neither were in any condition for a hike, or prepared to defend themselves wandlessly if they ran into trouble. Beyond that, things got contentious. Hermione reluctantly divulged the contents of her beaded bag, an assortment of mostly useless odd ends that hadn't made it into the tent. Mercifully, there was also some spare clothes, and most of the food she'd nicked from a muggle grocer the week before. She had also reluctantly admitted to Draco that she could do little in the way of wandless magic. Conjuring a spark in a bit of water wasn't much, but it was more than she'd expected. Over the last year, she'd been practicing summoning and levitating charms with little success. Her ultimate goal had been to one day cast a wandless shield, but she hadn't made much progress. Still better than Draco, though, which seemed like the critical thing even in their present circumstances. Draco's primary contribution, as far as Hermione was concerned, was conceding his uselessness. He had nothing besides the clothes on his back, and had never attempted wandless magic, and had no apparent objectives beyond survival and wand acquisition. In his estimation, finding the Order would be disastrous. Finding Death Eaters, even worse. "If anyone is looking for me, I can guarantee it's not a rescue operation," he insisted. "My lack of enthusiasm was already a problem, and that was before I didn't identify Potter, or up and disappeared with Potter's sidekick. What Bella did to you will look like playtime compared to what she'll do to me." Breaking into Ollivander's shop was his first choice. Relieving an unsuspecting witch or wizard of their wand was plan B. They needed a larger objective, she insisted. Find Harry, find the Order, find a place for him to hide, even. He resisted, complained, and contradicted himself, apparently wholly committed to playing devil's advocate to any and all suggestions. She mentally retracted any and all complaints she'd ever had about Harry and Ron always compelling her to be the one to come up with plans. They weren't lazy, she realized now. They were blessedly deferential, trusting, compliant. Draco, on the other hand, had opinions, questions, objections. Trying to resist reasoning with him was like trying to leave off picking at a particularly irritating scab. She knew she should leave it alone. It would go away if she could just ignore it. Once they found their way to civilization, they'd almost certainly be in Muggle territory, and he'd be at her mercy. Yet, the need to decisively be right compelled her to meet his absurd arguments with an impassioned answer. They ate a cold tin of beans and some scones. Draco complained over how stale the scones were, and she offered profuse melodramatic apologies, promising passing along his comments to the chef. It was all very conducive to Hermione refining the myriad reasons she had for disliking him. He was not the cartoonish villain it had been easy to paint him as from the heights of Gryffindor Tower. No, there were subtleties and nuances to his repugnance that she had failed to appreciate until now. Never had someone slipped so effortlessly under her skin, pricking at all her vulnerabilities and provoking her temper. She was used to being treated as a swat, a prig, even a mudblood. That she could have dealt with. Being treated as an idiot was new. With all due humility, she knew she was clever, and perhaps with the exception of SPEW, she was confident she knew how to sell her ideas, so having all her theories and suggestions met with profound skepticism was bracing, to say the least. There was also the distastefulness of somehow having all the blame for their present circumstances laid at her feet. She shouldn't have gotten caught. She should have just given Bellatrix what she wanted. She shouldn't have tried to apparate with another person's wand. She should have been better prepared. "Did you not have any plan for if you got separated? No contingencies? Nothing?" he demanded. "No," she bit out. "We never—" And that was when she realized their trio had been separated before, and had found their way back together. She could have smacked herself over her head for missing such an obvious solution. "Ron! Ron! Ron!" she shouted. "If you can hear me, it's safe. It'd be safe to come here. I have no wand. Ron!" Draco's estimation of her intelligence visibly dropped a few more pegs. "You know he's not just out hiding off in the bushes, yeah?" "Oh, for Malfoy, I swear to— If this doesn't work, I'm going to stay with you for the rest of the day just so I can throttle you in your sleep tonight." He raised an eyebrow. "Kinky." "Ron!" she called a little more desperately. "I would really like to get out of here. Ron, come on!" Is this the plan now? Because I'm not loving it. Hermione huffed. Ron has Dumbledore's Deluminator. She hesitated. When we got separated before, Ron flicked it at something, and he could hear us mentioning his name, and then he was able to apparate right to us. And Ron, if you could be Johnny on the spot about it, I'd be very, very grateful. With bated breath, Hermione looked through the trees, eyes combing the forest in anticipation of Ron appearing. She was still tense with anticipation and muttering to Ron minutes later, when Draco dropped back to his elbows, shaking his fringe from his eyes. A stupid toy made by old Dumbles in the hands of the weasel. Seems to be working about as well as I'd expect. Shove it! You know, I never understood how the weasel fit with your little group, he mused, towing a stick toward the drying fire. Seems like dead weight to me. So is that why you nearly killed him? Draco's expression darkened. That was an accident. Right. Collateral damage on your mission to kill Dumbledore and release Death Eaters into the school full of children. How could I possibly hold that against you? She sniped. Look, I didn't know the whole plan. Bit above my pay grade, if you can believe it. And he wanted Dumbledore dead. If I didn't do it, then Snape would have. The only difference I could see was in the likelihood my parents and I would be killed. He met her eyes defiantly. What would you have done? Something else, she said matter-of-factly. Brilliant. Why didn't I think of that? Well, you didn't do it in the end, did you? And you've lived to tell the tale. So, gambling on the mercy of the Dark Lord, then? Of course. How could I have missed that? Amazing the war's gone on this long with strategy like that in play. Hermione's fists were clenched so tight her nails were biting into her palms. Ron! For Merlin's sake, let's go! She yelled. Draco rolled his eyes. Right. Well, you seem to have screaming into the void thing covered, so I'll leave you to it. He stood, shifting his weight experimentally. I'm going to have a bit of a look around, see if there's a path or something. God, just kill me now, she muttered as he walked away, pulling her blankets tighter around her shoulders. The rest of the day was spent napping and gathering wood for their fire and branches to use as cover come nightfall. Hermione rested while Draco rambled. He returned with red-rimmed eyes. She suspected that while he was happy to complain to her at length, any real feeling he might have would be reserved for solitude. Perhaps she ought to have mocked him, but the sight of a man crying made her so earnestly uncomfortable that she ignored it entirely. She also pointedly ignored when he suddenly hissed in pain and dug his fingers viciously into his left forearm, the dark mark. Voldemort was calling. It gave her the heebie-jeebies. In his walking, Draco had come across a more sheltered spot near to sleep, and further afield, thought he'd seen a moor beyond the trees, and heard a river a little ways off. They decided it would be their objective first thing the next morning. Hermione was confident they were likely to meet with other people along a river. Rivers lead to things. Maybe they'd be able to spot a bridge and orient themselves from there. In any event, she could do with an opportunity to wash. As it began to grow dark, Hermione donned a navy hoodie of Harry's that she'd found in a plastic bag in a far corner of her commodious beaded bag. Magnanimously, she handed over a gray hoodie of Ron's to Draco, as well as a spare pair of socks. A pair of well-worn jeans was proffered as well, but that was apparently a bridge too far for him, the article itself as well as its previous owner giving him equal pause. If there was ever a cause open for her sainthood, Hermione felt sure her forbearance on this day ought to be taken into consideration. She contemplated sharing one of her 2 blankets with him. Her relentless conscience made a nuisance of itself with maxims about fairness and integrity, but she found such bothersome qualms could be assuaged by recollecting Draco's previous objections to her muddy germs. Less easy to allay was the guilt she'd felt after taking the time to recuperate while Harry and Ron were God knows where doing God knew what. They were together. They were in good enough shape to cast a Patronus, she reassured herself over and over. They could survive a few days without her. She couldn't be sure whether it was her conscience or her ego that needed to keep revisiting the question of how they would fare without her, but she doggedly tried to set it aside. They were probably worried sick, but there was nothing she could do about that unless the Deluminator decided to be useful. Control the things you can control, she repeated to herself as she drifted off to sleep, shivering and casting wary glances at a stoic face of Draco Malfoy through the flames of their bonfire. What would you have done? Draco's question played on a loop in her mind as they hiked toward the supposed river the next morning, weaving through seemingly endless pine trees, kicking up the carpet of dead needles underfoot. Stealing someone's child from them, not only physically but mentally and emotionally, was probably the cruelest thing you could do to a person, objectively speaking. But she'd done it. She'd done it to give the two people she was supposed to care about most. What wouldn't she do for her parents? The forest was thinning as they moved steadily downhill, and her legs ached with the strain of bracing her weight over the precarious terrain. Finally it leveled out as the trees gave way to scrubby coniferous bushes and a yellow sea of long, dead grass and heather spread over the rocky moor. What would you have done? What did cohabitating with the Dark Lord and Bellatrix Lestrange entail? She couldn't quite picture it. Did they sit down for dinner? How might they amuse themselves? She shuddered. None of the Malfoys had looked exactly bright-eyed and bushy-tailed the other night. She didn't know what their home might have looked like before all the Death Eaters took up residence, but the gothic House of Horrors vibe it had now seemed much more Bellatrix than Narcissa. She tried to imagine what it would be like to come down for breakfast with her parents and have the likes of Bellatrix Lestrange and Fenrir Greyback sitting across the table. To say nothing of Voldemort himself. How long had they been there? A year? Possibly 2? What would you have done? The wind blew harder over the open heath, but in the fleeting moments it relented. The tinkling sound of water could clearly be heard, and rivers drew people. Hermione kept scanning the horizon, waiting to see a visitor's pavilion, or a fire lookout on a nearby ridge, maybe some cars parked at a scenic viewpoint. She thought about Ron and Katie and Dumbledore. Poison was historically known as a woman's weapon, a way to dispense death from afar. The poisoned mead had been an objectively terrible plan. The cursed necklace that had nearly killed Katie was a proxy given to a proxy by another proxy. As for Dumbledore, according to Harry, Draco hadn't been able to bring himself to finish him, even as the old wizard had stood unarmed and apparently complacent. Draco had, in fact, been lowering his wand. He had failed his mission, but how hard did he really try? He wasn't stupid. He wasn't incompetent. He clearly didn't have the stomach to commit murder, whatever the stakes. What would you have done? Something else. She would have done something else. She just wasn't sure what. And she was beginning to worry she might have done what Draco couldn't. That insecurity was perhaps why she found herself pressing a wad of sphagnum moss into his hand, gritting out, "It's antiseptic," and restraining herself from launching into a full explanation of what that meant and how best to apply it to his wound. It had been clenched in her fists since she'd found it first thing that morning, its crushed appearance evidenced by her indecision over whether she should give it to him or just let it fall unnoticed to the ground. He took it without thanking her. Karma also did not see fit to show her any immediate gratitude. As it turned out, the sound of rushing water they'd been tracking was not a river. The mystery of how the sound of water could remain constant, even as the moor continued to roll out unbroken to distant peaks, was solved when, without warning, they found themselves nearly tripping down a rocky precipice. A narrow gully nearly 4 meters deep cut through the heath, concealing a fast-flowing little stream no more than 2 meters across. They had probably been meandering alongside it for some time. It was a precarious climb down over moss-covered rocks. Draco had gone down first and hovered below her. She honestly wasn't sure if he meant to catch her if she fell, or simply wanted a front-row seat for any misfortune that might befall her. Stubborn, gnarled little trees still bare of leaves provided some useful handholds, but Hermione still had some near misses. She had thought she already ached in every conceivable way, but by the time she reached the bottom with limbs to tremble, several broken, bleeding fingernails, she had discovered fresh agonies. The stream was clear but frigid. She had to brace herself just to plunge her forearms in and splash water on her face. Her fingers were burning with the cold by the time she'd washed and wrung out her jeans, knickers, and socks. Draco accepted Ron's jeans as if he were doing her a favor, which allowed him to wash his blood-soaked trousers, along with his makeshift bandage. Wash was perhaps a bit of a generous description of the tentative dip and swirl process he employed, but she supposed it was likely the first attempt at washing anything manually in his entire life. It probably did more for her entertainment than it did for the cleanliness of his clothes. Dressed now in jeans, a hoodie, and his suit jacket, Draco cut an interesting figure. The jeans were too big, and had to be cinched dramatically at the waist with his belt, and the knees were nearly worn through. The hoodie had a stained, indeterminate origin on it, and it bunched up under the sleeves of his suit jacket. On the plus side, he appeared deeply disturbed by his current state, and she half expected him to wail, "My father will hear about this," at any moment. "My kingdom for a camera," it slipped out. She hadn't meant to joke with him. He was so out of context here, she had to remind herself of who she was dealing with. Fortunately, he found it more offensive than humorous, scowling fiercely. "Yes, well, if your friend were a little less fat and poor, I wouldn't look so ridiculous." There he is, she thought. Different clothes, same arsehole. They took a conversational hiatus after that. Hermione considered trying to cast a drying charm on their clothes, but wandless magic was extraordinarily draining, and she didn't want to risk not being able to start a fire or conjure clean water to drink later. She did, however, do herself the kindness of casting a discreet scourgify on her knickers. The loo in the tent had been makeshift, but she missed it fiercely. She felt like she was caked in grime and sweat and fear itself. With wet clothes slung over her shoulders, they made their way downstream, walking single file along the ledge beside the stream. It was almost hypnotic. Time lost meaning as her mind filled with the sound of running water, and her world shrank to the meter of wet rock before her and the flexing soles of Draco's outlandishly posh shoes. The sky was gray, but it was warmer than it had been in weeks, and they were protected from the wind. The days were growing longer, but Hermione's strength flagged well before twilight. She made an excuse of coming upon a bit of sheltered recess to suggest they stop for the day. The gully had been growing steadily wider and more shallow, rising now to only head height, but the protection it provided from the elements was a more than reasonable inducement. Hermione also found the idea of being hidden from view quite comforting. After months of obsessively setting wards and protective enchantments around their camp, the lack of magical defenses was unnerving. She wanted to be found on her own terms. A small, sputtering fire was the best they could manage, with the scanty scrub and bits of green wood. It smoked horribly and wasn't likely to do much to dry their clothes. They found spots to prop themselves up, leaning into earthy corners which only utter exhaustion could render the least bit comfortable. They ate pickles, tinned peas, and the last of the stale scones in silence. Hermione would have done terrible, terrible things for a book. Instead, she closed her eyes to ward against the tension building in the silence and the temptation to ask all the questions that had been accumulating throughout the day, filling her throat till she was nearly choked by curiosity. What had he been doing for the last year? At Hogwarts? Did he know anything of her friends there? What was the other side planning? Whose side was he on? Why wasn't he calling her a mudblood? Was this just a fleeting truce? Were they the Germans and the British Christmas 1914? Did he know about the Horcruxes? The Hollows? What was making his brow furrow and his lips twitch over and over? And most of all, why? 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 She fell asleep none the wiser, and dreamt of trying to write her NEWTs while a dragon laid waste to the classroom. Progress was slow. The sky held enough of a threat of rain to hurry their pace, but the terrain was all hills, and along with being prodigiously sore, neither Hermione nor Draco were accustomed to walking great distances. Silence, too, was becoming wearying. Alone with her thoughts, Hermione was working herself up to a full-blown anxiety attack. There were 1,000 unpleasant things to consider, and not one thing she could do about any of them. Finally, she couldn't take it any more. Tugging nervously at the end of her braid, let herself give a cautious voice to some of the questions that had been nagging at her. "What happened before we left?" Draco startled a little at her breach of the peace, but overly returned a questioning look. She pushed on. "I wasn't exactly alert, but I know that there were spells being cast. I thought I heard my name." She was studying the horizon, unwilling to let him see how badly she needed an answer. "I'm not sure exactly," he said slowly. "Bella was working on the goblin. It seemed like she might be going back for you, but there was a commotion down the hall, and suddenly everyone was distracted. Maybe if Potter and Weasley really did escape, it could have been them. I don't know who all were down in the dungeon except them, and Lovegood. But—" "Luna," Hermione interrupted. "Yeah, so I heard. Anyway, leaving seemed prudent. Next thing I knew, it felt like I'd been sidelonged by a concussed troll." "With me?" She peeked over and saw him wince. "With you." Apparently, further explanation of that most interesting point would not be forthcoming. They met with a steep bit of hill climbing and lapsed back into silence. Hermione had to work hard to keep up with Draco's long strides, but she grit her teeth and pressed on. She wasn't sure if Draco would wait up for her if she fell behind, and she refused to find out the hard way. When the going got a bit easier again, she decided to push her luck. "What about Hogwarts?" He sighed, raking a hand through his hair. "Can we not?" "You were there?" she asked. She took his silence for assent. "My friends, are any of them—" She held her breath through a long pause. "No, not that I know of." She thought that was all he was likely to say, but after a couple of minutes he volunteered. "I didn't think he had it in him, but Longbottom's been giving them hell." Hermione ducked her head as a wide smile broke over her face. Good old Nev. Just about everybody underestimated Neville Longbottom, but no one more so than Severus Snape. The idea of Neville defying the traitorous, usurping headmaster positively warmed the cockles of her heart. She couldn't wait to wrap him up in a hug and tell him how proud she was. It was the happiest thought she'd entertained in months, and she turned it over fondly for hours. When they stopped in the early afternoon, it was with an ostensible agreement that it would be a short break, and a tacit understanding that they wouldn't be going any further today. While the effects of the Cruciatus had mostly passed, aside from an occasional shaking of her hands, Hermione was sore and exhausted and had yet to see anything that remotely suggested other humans were nearby. They were at a middling level of elevation, and trees were stunted and relatively sparse. It was a lousy place to camp, but needs must. As she sat back against the trunk of a hawthorn, she began a mental review of everything that might be relevant to finding their way out of this wilderness, turning every scrap of information over in her mind for the umpteenth time. Her eyes were beginning to droop when her drowsy reverie was interrupted. "I'm bored." Draco, who had been lying back in the grass, rolled over to his stomach to look at her. "Only boring people get bored," she replied reflexively. "That's such a boring thing to say," he whined. "Well, that's your problem." "Bollocks. This is objectively boring. You're bored too. You have to be." Hermione shook her head resolutely. On top of being a spoiled git and only child, she knew he was accustomed to being the center of attention amongst their peers. He'd always had to make snarky little comments in class to try and get a laugh, make ostentatious maneuvers on the Quidditch pitch, and at mealtimes he could be seen holding court at the Slytherin table. After 2 days away from his usual sycophantic fixes, his ego was probably going into withdrawal. She could practically feel the neediness rolling off of him in waves. "We could," he started. "Ha! We will be doing nothing. I'd rather let my brain fully atrophy than subject myself to any more of your childish antagonism than I absolutely have to." His eyes drew together, and there was a wry twist to his lips. "Oh, I'm the antagonist here. So you really do just have zero self-awareness, then?" She folded her arms stubbornly across her chest. She was not going to let him bait her. "Look, I know you think I'm the literal devil or whatever, but—" Hermione's mind flashed to the fireside ruminations from their first night, and her eyes narrowed. "Are you using legitimacy on me?" she demanded. "Legitimacy? Why would I— Wait, you actually think I'm the devil? I said that for dramatic effect." He sounded amazed. "Granger." "I mean, not literally, obviously. Just, it was a metaphor or something." Well, this was embarrassing. "You find me that intimidating, do you?" The level of smugness was off the charts. "Tell me, are you worried I'm reading your mind right now?" Hermione's mind instantly began running through a veritable catalogue of wildly inappropriate thoughts, top-secret information, and embarrassing memories. Oh, fuck off. She was sure he couldn't actually perform legitimacy. Mostly sure. 94%. "There are much bigger baddies than me for you to worry about." "Trust me, I am not worried about you." He smiled a Cheshire grin and bounced his eyebrows, crowling forward a few feet. "Not even a little bit." "No." She stuck her chin out stubbornly. "Good. Then you could stop acting like a scared little firstie." "I am not." She crossed her arms petulantly. "See? Always so childish." "Jesus." "You're a woman of extremes. First I'm the devil. Now we've gone the other way." He crossed the short distance between them as he spoke, settling himself cross-legged beneath the canopy of her tree. Hard to believe I wanted to deprive myself of the pleasure of your conversation. He blithely disregarded her sarcasm. I know. Now, tell me something interesting. What is it you've been up to? Ha! No! Have you been following Quidditch? You can't be serious. Read anything good lately? I'm not doing this. You know, I was thinking about buying a few more house elves. Maybe one to see to each of my rooms, and a couple extra to tend to my wardrobe. That's just... You wouldn't! I might. The longer I sit here and think about it, the better it sounds. If someone doesn't distract me soon, I'll start firming up my plans. What kind of blackmail is this? You need attention so desperately you're willing to enslave intelligent, powerful magical beings to do it? Have you ever even had a proper conversation with a house elf? And with that, she was off and running on her SPEW spiel, determined to wipe that smug look off his face. He lobbed straw man arguments and faulty premises at her until she was red in the face. Until she finally realized that he wasn't invested in his side of the argument at all, and she'd just given him exactly what he wanted. She was spitting mad enough to launch into a diatribe about entitled aristocracy and their no-account, morally repugnant offspring, which led to a heated argument about the Muggle class system. Before she knew what was what, the day was dying away, and she was making herself comfortable beside a fire, eating lentil stew and defending the bloody ministry as she made a case for wealth redistribution within the context of a meritocracy. What a fucking Slytherin!